Around Thanksgiving, I got my first ever reptile. She's a 2-month-old crested gecko, and I have to say, I've loved having her. She's got a great personality and she's really fun to interact with. This is a 2-part series on how I made her enclosure. The first part will be converting the 40-gallon, while the second part will be making the background, adding the hardscape, and planting the tank. Now without further ado, let's get started. For the enclosure itself, I'm using a 40-gallon breeder. The first thing I did was make an area for the substrate. To do that, I'm cutting a small piece of glass that will fit over the bottom of the tank. I ran a glass cutter along the glass, then tapped the glass lightly. After that, it could be easily snapped in half. Before attaching it to the tank, I wiped it down with rubbing alcohol to remove debris, then put tape on it to make sure I get a clean bead of silicone. I then repeated the process on the other side. After that, I could attach it to the tank. I wiped it down to remove debris, then ran a bead of silicone along the rim. Once that was done, I pressed the glass into place and ran a bead of silicone along the top. I then smoothed it out with my finger. I then used more rubbing alcohol to wipe down some of the excess silicone. Then I peeled off the tape. Next thing to do is to make the door. To do so, I'm going to be using a piece of polycarbonate that I cut to size using a table saw. The first time I made this door for the Mossy Frog tank, I used acrylic, and unfortunately due to the humidity, it warped. However, polycarbonate does not warp under humidity. I also cut a few thin strips of wood that I'll be using as a rim for the door. The wood will go onto the side of the polycarbonate and act as a place to hold hinges, latches, and a handle. Before I could attach them though, I had to cut them to size. I lined them up with the edge of the polycarbonate and marked where to cut. Then I used a saw and cut along the mark. I also sanded them down a bit because they were a little rough on the corners. Once everything had been sanded, I could attach them to the door. To do so, I'm using a 2-part epoxy resin. Once the epoxy was mixed up, I could attach the wood to the door. First thing I did was remove the protective covering on the polycarbonate. Then I applied some epoxy on one side of the wood and pressed it firmly into place. Next thing is to paint it. I put a piece of painting tape down to ensure that I don't spill any paint onto the door. Now on to painting. You don't need anything fancy for this, just a cheap acrylic paint will do. Next thing I did was measure for where to attach the handle. Again, I used epoxy and pressed it firmly into place. Next, I'll address the hinges. Unfortunately, the rim of the door and the rim of the tank aren't completely flush, so I'll need to make a polycarbonate spacer. To do that, I'll trace the side of the hinge onto the polycarbonate, then cut it with a saw. I then used more epoxy to attach the spacers to the hinges. Then I attached both of them to the door. After that, I could attach them to the rim of the tank. I scored the surface so that the epoxy would adhere better, and I also did the same to all of the polycarbonate pieces. I would have preferred to use screws to attach the hinges, but unfortunately right under the rim of the aquarium is glass, so I really had no choice. Next I need to make latches. I cut an assortment of polycarbonate pieces and drilled a hole into one of them. Once I had all the pieces cut and drilled, I could start assembling them with more epoxy. Then I painted them with more acrylic paint. I also attached a few little knobs to make it easier to use the latches. All of this seems pretty confusing now, but will make sense later in the video. Anyway, once everything was painted, I could start attaching it to the tank. The latch is attached to the rim of the door using a nail and slides into this little holder very easily. I drilled a hole through the rim of the door and stuck the latch in it. I then used wire cutters to trim the bottom of the nail. I also used a little bit of super glue to make sure the latch wouldn't come out. Anyway, with the latches done, I could move on to the final piece, the ventilation. I'll be making it out of window screen pieces. I've used this technique in the past to make various lids, ventilation, and other pieces, and I've had great success. Anyway, the first thing I did was start to cut the pieces to size. Once I had the first couple pieces cut, I test fit everything in the tank. Unfortunately, the corner pieces were a little bit long on the sides, so I had to cut them down a bit. After all the pieces were cut, I could start attaching the window screen mesh. This was pretty easy to do. All I did was cut a piece of mesh to size and use the spline ruler to attach the spline. Then I used a razor blade to cut off the excess mesh. With everything cut, I put the screen onto the tank, and that completes part 1 of this series. Stay tuned for part 2, which should be released next week. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this one, and I can't wait to show you the final product. Thanks for watching.